on November 14th at 3 a.m. At 3 a.m. local time in Venezuela, submarine captain Carlos Mendez, with 16 years of experience in underwater operations, received an encrypted message via the ultra-low-frequency communications system linking the submarine Bolivar to the naval base in Puerto Cabello. This message was sent from the depths of the Caribbean, 232 meters below sea level. Specific instructions that would change the course of history were included in the message, transmitted via an encrypted code that took 38 seconds to fully decipher. A U.S. military vessel had been observed operating in waters that Venezuela considered part of its exclusive economic zone. This ship, known as the USS Gravely, a Harlech BG-class guided missile destroyer, was conducting operations that the Venezuelan command considered a hostile intrusion into its territory. It was operating approximately 315 kilometers north of the Venezuelan coast. Mendez read the message twice, fully understanding its consequences. He was being instructed to organize a show of force, a tactical deployment that the Americans would undoubtedly detect and that would send a clear message that Venezuela would not tolerate the U.S. military presence in its exclusive economic zone. However, unless he receives additional explicit instructions, Mendez should not carry out an actual attack. For the time being, he should simply steer the Bolivar submarine to the USS Gravely's location, using all available resources to avoid detection. Once properly positioned, it would begin passive acoustic reconnaissance operations, which would collect all technical information about the U.S. vessel. The Bolivar submarine was a Scorpion-class vessel, a state-of-the-art design created in France, which had been transferred to Venezuela about 8 years ago as part of a military agreement between the two nations. With a length of 66 meters, a maximum operational depth of 350 meters, and an underwater displacement of 3,200 tons, the Bolivar was an advanced submarine platform capable of operating for extended periods without needing to surface for urgent reasons. Its propulsion system consisted of 4 diesel-electric engines that enabled it to reach a maximum submerged speed of about 20 knots, although operationally lower speeds were preferred as they produced less noise and reduced the risk of detection. The Bolivar's armament included 8 subsurface anti-ship missiles that could be launched from the torpedo tubes and had a range of over 100 kilometers. It also included 4 600-millimeter torpedo tubes capable of firing passive and active torpedoes with ranges of up to 60 kilometers. The Bolivar was equipped with highly advanced passive acoustic surveillance systems, in addition to its offensive capabilities, including linear hydrophone arrays capable of identifying and classifying virtually any underwater or surface noise source in the surrounding ocean. Mendez went directly to the submarine's control room, a cramped space located in the center of the vessel's pressure hull, where all the primary control stations were located. He instructed the submarine to begin a controlled ascent from its current depth of 232 meters to periscope depth of approximately 16 meters. At this depth, it would be able to use its periscope to obtain visual information about the U.S. vessel, whose presence in the area had already been confirmed. However, as they ascended, Mendez gave the order to activate all passive detection systems at maximum, allowing the submarine's acoustic operators to begin compiling a comprehensive profile of all noise produced by the USS Gravely. At that moment, the USS Gravely was moving at 16 knots in a circular patrol pattern, carrying out what the U.S. Navy considered entirely legitimate freedom of navigation operations in international waters. At 155 meters in length, weighing around 9,600 tons and crewed by 312 sailors, the ship was one of the most heavily armed destroyers in service with the U.S. Navy. Its weapons system, the legendary X, was regarded by many as the gold standard in integrated naval defense technology. This system was capable of simultaneously tracking up to 100 underwater, aerial, and surface targets, and engaging several of them simultaneously with various weapon systems. The radar and a T-shaped antenna were at the core of IIS, an active-passive 3-dimensional radar capable of locating aerial targets at over 160 kilometers and surface submarines at even greater distances. The radar was connected to a sophisticated computer system that processed all radar information, as well as data from other sensors, such as optical and infrared, and tactical communications data. This information was shared among several ships in the fleet. The USS Gravely also featured a Mark 401 vertical launch system, which had 96 launch cells capable of firing a variety of missiles, such as ASROC anti-submarine missiles with a maximum range of 64 km, SM-2 standard anti-aircraft missiles reaching up to 135 km, and Tomahawk cruise missiles, which could travel over 1,600 km. The destroyer also had a 5-inch naval gun capable of engaging surface targets at ranges of up to 37 km when using GPS-guided extended-range ammunition. But Captain Mendez of the submarine Bolivar, as he ascended to periscope depth and the USS Gravely continued its patrol, unaware that an enemy submarine was silently approaching from the depths below. Through the periscope, Mendo had his first visual sighting of the target. It was a spectacular scene, a metallic grey ship whose faceted superstructure was specifically designed to reduce its radar signature. The system's antennas were clearly visible, rotating constantly as they scanned the surrounding airspace. However, what was most relevant to Mendez was that his ears were beginning to pick up sounds through the passive acoustic detection systems. The USS Groll produced a distinctive and exclusive acoustic signature, a specific blend of noises generated by the operation of its systems. The pumping of the seawater cooling systems, the operation of the propulsion gas turbines, the noise from various electronic devices, and the cavitation of the propellers as they cut through the water were factors that, together, produced a unique acoustic signature. This was practically like an underwater DNA, as identifiable and distinctive as a fingerprint. Bolivar's acoustic operators began recording and storing this entire acoustic signature in their computer systems. This was the level of naval intelligence Caracas had been seeking, a comprehensive technical description of one of the U.S. Navy's most sophisticated destroyers. At that moment, Lieutenant James Morrison, the submarine defense officer aboard the USS Gravel, was reviewing routine information at his anti-submarine warfare station. The USS Gravel's detection systems included both active and passive sonar, among which was the XS-63 sonar system. The latter is a passive system that detects underwater noises without emitting its own signals. Additionally, the Gravely included an anti-submarine warfare helicopter, a Sikorsky SH-60B Seahawk, which was ready for an aerial patrol mission on the ship's flight deck. When Morrison was reviewing the passive sonar data, he noticed something strange. Although it wasn't a conclusive finding, it was an anomaly. There was a subtle noise pattern that didn't match any of the typical sources usually heard in the Caribbean. He ordered the active sonar systems to be activated and to begin a search sweep without delay. Active sonar operated by emitting sound pulses into the water and then listening for the echoes reflected off submerged objects. However, the precise moment the USS Gravely activated its active sonar was also when Captain Mendez realized he had been detected. The active sonar emitted a pulse that spread through the water at a speed of about 100 meters per second, which is the same as the speed of sound in water. It was picked up by the Bolivar submarine's acoustic sensors almost immediately. Mendez ordered the Bolivar to execute an evasive maneuver, diving to great depth and increasing its speed to 18 knots. However, the situation had now escalated significantly. The USS Gravely had confirmed that a submarine was present. The next step would be to activate anti-submarine countermeasures. Morrison immediately announced, via the ship's communication channels, that an unclassified underwater contact had been detected. Captain David Reynolds, who is in command of the USS Gravely, was immediately informed. Reynolds, who has 23 years of naval experience in the engine room, immediately understood the consequences. An unknown, possibly hostile submarine was operating near their ship in the Caribbean. He ordered the SH-60B helicopter to be deployed immediately to carry out anti-submarine operations. Additionally, he ordered the Gravely's speed to be increased to 24 knots, positioning the ship in a defensive posture. The SH-60B, with its rotors spinning, lifted off from the deck of the USS Gravely and soared into the sky. After reaching its operational altitude of around 300 namisim, the helicopter oriented its nose toward the location where underwater contact had been detected. The Bolivar submarine had an additional anti-submarine search capability thanks to a towed sonar, a sensor that could be lowered into the water column from the helicopter in flight. Mendez was performing a series of complex evasive maneuvers. He was diving deep, taking advantage of the seabed's underwater topography. He was looking for canyons and rock formations where the submarine could hide. Its speed had increased, but this brought with it an increase in acoustic noise. Now it was much easier to identify. Menz was aware that he had only a few minutes, perhaps even less, before the US helicopter achieved a stable acoustic detection of the Bolivar. At that moment, the situation could turn deadly. The US anti-submarine helicopters were equipped with advanced anti-submarine weaponry, such as acoustic homing torpedoes, which could be launched from the air. Mendez ordered that the Bolivar's entire arsenal be ready for immediate use. The torpedo tubes were opened, and then active-passive homing torpedoes were loaded into the launch chambers. The submarine-launched anti-ship missiles were also ready for launch, but to do so, the submarine had to surface enough for part of the launch tube to be above water. Mendez was in a very unfavorable tactical situation. He had a powerful US warship sailing on the surface and an anti-submarine helicopter flying overhead, conducting active searches. His options were limited. Theoretically, it could launch a preemptive attack against the USS Gravely in an attempt to damage or destroy the ship using its torpedoes. However, this would escalate the situation from an incident to an open armed conflict. He could also try to escape by using his superior speed and maneuverability to avoid contact and exit Venezuelan waters, or he could negotiate surfacing and establish radio communications with the USS Gravely to justify his presence. When Mendez received a message via his ultra-low-frequency communication system, he was awaiting instructions from Caracas. The message was clear. He had been granted authorization to carry out a warning attack. This meant he would have to fire a torpedo, but it would be programmed to detonate at a safe distance from the USS Gravely, yet close enough for the American ship to feel the shockwave of the explosion. This would be a clear and direct message. Mendez reviewed the authorization twice and realized it was legitimate. Then he ordered a torpedo to be prepared for launch. An active-passive homing 439mm torpedo was selected as the weapon, with a warhead containing 600 kilograms of explosive charge, a maximum speed of 35 knots, and a maximum range of 30 kilometers. The torpedo was loaded into the first tube. The detonation range was set to 500 miles from the target instead of a direct hit, and its guidance system was configured to track and pursue any acoustic contact matching the known profile of the USS Gravel. Then Mendez gave the order to open the torpedo tube to the ocean so that the torpedo was directly exposed to the surrounding water. Everything was ready. Mendez, via the ultra-low-frequency communication system, reiterated that he was prepared to launch the warning torpedo. He was authorized to proceed immediately. Mendez took a deep breath and then gave the instruction, "Launch tube number 1." In torpedo tube number 1, the gunpowder was detonated in a controlled manner, launching the torpedo out of its chamber at an initial velocity of 8 meters per second. Once the torpedo was fully clear of the tube, its propulsion system activated automatically. This propelled it through the water at an initial speed of 15 knots, which gradually increased to 35 knots as it reached its maximum cruising speed. The torpedo's guidance system activated simultaneously with its active sonar, which began emitting sound pulses in all directions, attempting to find any acoustic contact that matched the established search parameters. The USS Gravely was detected by the torpedo's active search sonar system less than 2 seconds after launch. The acoustic profile was exactly the same. The torpedo correctly detected its target and began navigating toward it. On the USS Gravely, the ship's active acoustic detection system was the first to identify the torpedo's arrival. The acoustic detector began sounding an alarm that all onboard devices immediately identified as a torpedo detection. Alarms went off throughout the ship. Captain Reynolds was immediately informed that a torpedo had been fired from an unknown underwater position and was approaching the vessel at 35 knots. This was not an incident. It was an attack. Reynolds immediately ordered the Gravely to execute maximum evasive maneuvers, accelerating to full speed and performing a series of sharp turns to minimize the torpedo's target profile. Reynolds also ordered the vertical launch system to deploy anti-submarine countermeasures. The ASR anti-submarine missiles launched cruise projectiles that headed toward the approximate position of the adversary submarine, with active acoustic homing heads that submerged into the water and searched for any underwater contact. The SH-60B helicopter, which was airborne, was informed of the situation and ordered to implement additional countermeasures. The helicopter operator deployed towed sonar buoys into the water, creating an acoustic curtain that could confuse the approaching torpedo. However, the torpedo launched from the submarine Bolivar was not a fully autonomous, intelligent homing weapon. It had been programmed with lace gravel coordinates based on position data recorded just seconds before launch. The torpedo was navigating toward those coordinates. As it approached, its active search sonar system would provide course corrections. The USS Gravely was performing evasive maneuvers, but the torpedo was traveling at 35 knots, about 40 km/h, a speed far greater than the 16 knots the USS Gravely could reach at that moment. Due to propulsion system limitations, the distance between the torpedo and the ship gradually decreased. 25 km, 20 km, 15 km. Captain Reynolds was watching the torpedo's live approach data on the tactical display from the bridge of the USS Gravel. He was aware that the torpedo would strike if an effective countermeasure wasn't found. His last resort was to activate the ship's close-in weapon system, the Phalanx CIWS, an automated gun system that could engage the torpedo if it surfaced far enough. However, it was unlikely that a submarine-propelled torpedo would surface. It was more likely to detonate underwater, using the underwater explosion to generate a shockwave capable of fracturing the Gravel's hull, even if the torpedo didn't strike directly. The ASROS anti-submarine missiles, fired from the USS Gravely, began arriving at their target positions when they were 10 km away. The ASROS were, in essence, aerial torpedo projectiles that streaked through the air to reach calculated locations. Once there, they submerged and activated their acoustic search systems. The ASROCs were deployed in such a way that their coverage pattern encompassed the location of the Bolivar submarine, creating a search network and potentially damaging it. The ASROCs were detected by Mendez using his passive acoustic identification systems. He was aware that they were approaching. Once again, it performed evasive maneuvers. It increased its speed and dove deeper. However, the ASROCs were deploying in a wide pattern that made avoiding them completely impossible. The torpedo that had been Anivia was launched from the Bolivar at a range of 5 kilometers. The USS Gravely, using its active search sonar system, precisely identified its target. The torpedo made final adjustments to its trajectory, altering its course to ensure it would pass within the programmed 500-meter detonation range of the target. The distance continued to decrease, 3 kilometers, 2 kilometers, then 1 kilometer. At a distance of about 1.2 miles from the USS Gravel, the torpedo reached its programmed detonation range. The torpedo's proximity fuse activated and detonated the warhead. The detonation of the 600-kilogram warhead produced a massive underwater explosion, releasing energy equivalent to approximately 150 tons of TNT. From the point of detonation, the shockwave spread through the water in all directions. When it reached the USS Gravely, it did so with immense force. Although the Gravely's hull is a reinforced steel structure between 30 and 40 mm thick, the shockwave pressed it inward. The shockwave pressure was calculated at over 100 tons per square meter, which is roughly equivalent to being submerged underwater at a depth of 200 meters. The entire ship's structure swayed and twisted from the impact. The ship's internal systems were violently shaken, causing the men to fall to the floor. The pipes were stripped from their supports. The shockwave affected some electronic systems, causing them to fail. However, the Gravely's hull sustained no damage. I had an appointment. Yes, the exterior structure exhibited visible deformations. However, the overall structural integrity of the ship was preserved. The USS Gravely remained afloat. On the bridge, Captain Reynolds recovered after being knocked down by the force of the explosion. He immediately requested a damage report. The reports began to come in. Propulsion was partially compromised. Some communication systems were offline. The radar was displaying erratic readings, but most importantly, the hull showed signs of acute stress, with small leaks beginning to appear in various compartments. Nevertheless, the Gravely's pumping systems, which had been designed specifically to handle such emergency situations, began extracting water from the affected sections, allowing the ship to stay afloat. Reynolds instructed that an urgent message be sent immediately to Atlantic Command in Norfolk, Virginia, reporting that the USS Gravely had been attacked by an underwater weapon and requesting urgent assistance. At the same time this was happening, the ASROCs launched from the west, Gravely were hitting the water near the submarine Bolivar. When they hit the water, the ASROCs immediately sank and their acoustic search systems began operating. The ASROCs began scanning the surrounding water to identify any acoustic contact resembling the underwater noise profiles recognized at El Bolivar. Mendez observed that there were several anti-submarine weapons in the water near his position. It performed emergency maneuvers, submerging the submarine to a depth of over 300 meters in an attempt to escape. However, the ASROCs were equipped with very advanced search systems. One of the ASROCs identified the Bolivar as the submarine was trying to escape. The ASROC made course corrections and headed straight for the Bolivar. In the end, however, Mendez disrupted the ROC's approach with his passive sonar. While simultaneously deploying acoustic jamming buoys that emitted noise to disorient the ASROC's search systems, he executed an emergency maneuver, abruptly veering the submarine to one side. The ASROC passed through the area where the submarine had been just seconds before, but it did not firmly detect the Bolivar. The ASROC continued searching, but gradually lost acoustic detection of the submarine. As it moved away, Mendez kept the Bolivar at maximum depth and remained silent as he waited. The other ASRCKs continued searching, but the Bolivar managed to evade any direct impact. Nevertheless, the message had been sent. In Norfolk, Virginia, the Venezuelan submarine had effectively attacked a U.S. warship. At Atlantic Command, at 4:35 a.m., General Thomas Bradford received an urgent call at his home from his team. He was notified that immediate assistance was required because an underwater weapon had attacked the USS Gravely in the Caribbean. Bradford got dressed and went to command headquarters immediately. What he found was an environment of absolute crisis. The full defensive capacity of the Western Atlantic was being activated. More ships were being deployed, aircraft were being repositioned, and alerts were being sent to all U.S. military personnel in the Caribbean and along the U.S. coast. Bradford was fully informed about the situation. A submarine, apparently from Venezuela, had fired a warning torpedo at the USS Gravely. The torpedo had detonated at a distance, causing considerable but non-lethal damage. Despite being damaged, the USS Gravely remained operational. However, what was clear was that they had carried out an armed attack on a U.S. warship. This was not merely an incident, it was an act of war. Bradford reported the incident to the Pentagon immediately. General William Tate, who heads the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was awakened and informed. Afterward, the Secretary of Defense was awakened and briefed. The U.S. President was awakened at the White House to receive a briefing. The President convened an emergency meeting of the National Security Council in the White House Situation Room. A video conference session was convened with key national security officials, including the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, and others. The session began with a detailed briefing on the incident. In the Caribbean, a reportedly Venezuelan submarine, which was not identified, had carried out a warning torpedo attack against the USS Gravely. The ship, although it had sustained considerable damage, remained operational and capable of navigation. No deaths had been reported. Nevertheless, a U.S. warship had been attacked. This required a response. The Secretary of Defense presented immediate alternatives. The first alternative was a limited retaliatory response, targeting certain Venezuelan military installations, but avoiding situations that would cause significant civilian casualties. Alternative 2 consisted of a more extensive response, employing a diversified air force against various Venezuelan military targets. The third option was a full-scale response, which included possible attacks on Venezuela's civilian infrastructure. The President listened to each alternative and its possible repercussions. Then he made a decision that would be remembered throughout history. He ordered that a proportionate retaliatory response be launched. A fleet of precision bombers would be used against specific military targets in Venezuela. Additional carrier groups would be deployed to the Caribbean. Diplomatic and economic warfare strategies would be used against Venezuela, but civilian infrastructure would not be attacked. The aim would be to demonstrate to the Venezuelan government that striking US warships would have serious repercussions, but that the United States was trying to prevent an escalation into a full-blown confrontation. The president immediately authorized the deployment of air forces. In 30 minutes, it was declassified. F-18 Super Hornet fighter bombers were launched from bases in Florida. B-52 bombers were sent from bases in Louisiana. Apache attack helicopters were being sent from Panamanian bases. Mobile Patriot air defense systems were being deployed in Florida. At Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, a squadron of F-18 fighter jets was activated for a possible deployment operation to the Caribbean. Additionally, an additional carrier strike group was sent to that region. A squadron of B-5 Cock bombers was put on alert at Robbins Air Force Base in Georgia for possible deployment. A squadron of Apache attack helicopters was put on alert at H. Buer Air Base in Florida. The United States war machine was being activated in Venezuela. The Ministry of Defense in Caracas admitted that the submarine Bolivar had successfully attacked the USS Gravel. The challenge message had been sent. However, it was also known that this would have repercussions. The Venezuelan command began receiving reports of a large military movement by the United States. Diplomatic alerts were being issued, carrier groups were being moved, and air forces were being deployed. The Venezuelan government understood that it had crossed a line, and what had begun as a regional defense. Now it had become a potential confrontation with the world's strongest military superpower. General Tate, at the head of the Pentagon, ordered the preparation of a detailed operational plan. This plan would include precision airstrikes on specific military installations in Venezuela. The target facilities would be chosen to inflict the greatest possible military damage while minimizing harm to civilians. The identified targets included the Puerto Cabello Naval Base, which housed the submarine command headquarters. The air bases in Barquisimeto and Maturin, where helicopters and houses were stored. The air defense facilities located in the Central Mountains, which housed missile and surface-to-air systems, as well as the Venezuelan Navy's fuel and ammunition depots. The plan was drawn up over the next 3 hours. When it was finished, it was presented to the president for approval. After evaluating the alternatives, the president gave the green light for the plan to be executed. The first assault would take place at 7:30 a.m. Central Time, 6 hours after the submarine Bolivar attacked the USS Gravely. This would provide adequate time for the U.S. Air Force to deploy into attack positions. At that point, the B-52H bombers, deployed from bases in Louisiana, would be positioned over the Gulf of Mexico and beyond the reach of known Venezuelan air defenses. They would be prepared to carry out long-range cruise missile strikes. The F-18 fighter bombers, meanwhile, would operate from bases in Florida to carry out low-penetration attacks. Apache helicopters, stationed at Panamanian bases, would be ready to carry out precision strikes. The Patriot air defense systems in Florida would be ready to intercept any Venezuelan aircraft attempting to reach the U.S. attackers at the Puerto Cabello Naval Base. In Venezuela, Captain Mendez was receiving information about the U.S. military movement that had been detected by the country's intelligence services. It was known that air raids were being organized. Venezuela's defenses were being activated. The air defense systems were being prepared for maximum alert. Venezuelan aircraft, particularly the Grumman F-2 Tiger Shark and the F-16 Falcon, were being prepared for an emergency flight. Military bases were being reinforced. Civilian personnel were being evacuated from areas near identified military targets. Mendez was aware that he had unleashed a storm by attacking the USS Gravely. He ordered the submarine Bolivar to return to the depths in search of safety in anonymity. The first U.S. airstrikes were carried out exactly at 7:30 a.m. Central Time. B-52H bombers, flying over the Gulf of Mexico, began launching Tomahawk missiles toward their targets in Venezuela. Each cruise missile, flying over the Gulf of Mexico northward toward Venezuela at low altitude to avoid detection by air surveillance radars, was on that heading. The missiles were flying at a speed of approximately 850 km/h, which meant that an aerial journey of about 600 kilometers would take around 42 minutes. The F-18 fighter bombers were launched from Florida while the cruise missiles were in the air. They were heading toward Venezuela, flying in formation and heading south. Each F-18 carried a mixed weapons load, including conventional gravity bombs, Powerway 3 air-to-ground missiles or high-precision laser-guided missiles, and self-defense ammunition. The Apache helicopters, based in Panama, were also sent to fly low to the ground, approaching their target areas. Venezuela's skies were about to be engulfed in fire. In Puerto Cabello, the country's air surveillance radars detected the arrival of cruise missiles. Alarms went off across the country. Venezuela's air defense systems initiated active searches to try to locate the incoming targets. However, the low-flying Tomahawk cruise missiles were extremely difficult to detect. They flew just above the ground, avoiding mountains and hills, while minimizing their radar signature. Venezuela's air defense forces launched surface-to-air missiles, although most of them failed to hit their targets. The cruise missiles continued to approach their targets. The initial impacts occurred at 8:12 a.m. A naval base in Puerto Cabello was struck by a cruise missile that hit the hangar where submarines were kept. The explosion was deafening. The hangar sustained considerable damage to its infrastructure because it was partially destroyed. More missiles kept falling. A fuel depot was destroyed. An ammunition storage facility was hit, triggering a chain of secondary explosions visible for miles. Cruise missiles continued to destroy the naval base as F-18 fighter bombers approached their targets. At the Barquisimeto Air Base, F-18s were firing PW-13 air-to-ground missiles. The missiles equipped with laser-guided precision seekers were guided to their preset targets with great accuracy. The hangars containing houses were hit. The runways were damaged by runway-penetrating bombs. The air defense systems were hit. The Barquisimeto Air Base was turned into a scorched landscape of smoldering rubble in less than 3 minutes. While carrying out precision strikes against ammunition depots using advanced thermal imaging systems, the Apache helicopters, they detected specific targets and destroyed them using high-precision Hellfire missiles. Each Hellfire strike involved a controlled explosion that annihilated the target without causing excessive civilian damage. The attack lasted 35 minutes. When it was over, the military installations in Venezuela that had been identified as high-value targets were destroyed. The damage was estimated at several $billion. But more importantly, Venezuela's offensive military capability had been significantly degraded. The submarine Bolívar, although not directly hit, had been sidelined from operations by the military disarray that had ensued. The Venezuelan houses that had not been destroyed on land were distributed to distant bases. Venezuela's air defenses had been seriously compromised. General T. Torrealba was monitoring the operation's progress in real time at the Pentagon, using satellite data and field communications. U.S. operators confirmed that Venezuela's military infrastructure had suffered massive damage. The operation was proceeding successfully at the tactical level. However, Tite also knew that what had happened had political and diplomatic consequences. A direct military attack against a sovereign nation had been carried out by the United States. This would have a significant international impact. It is likely that the United Nations will convene an extraordinary session of the Security Council. The international community would express its condemnation. U.S. allies would express concern, but it would also be clearly understood that any power attacking the United States would face drastic retaliation. The President of the United States appeared in the White House press briefing room at 9 a.m. Central Time. A formal press statement was issued. The message stated that the USS Gravely had been attacked without provocation by Venezuelan submarine forces. In response, the United States had carried out limited retaliatory strikes against certain Venezuelan military installations. The United States regretted any unintended civilian casualties, but had implemented relevant measures to reduce such harm. Although the United States did not want a new conflict with Venezuela, it would protect its warships and military troops against any future aggression. The Venezuelan government was going through a period of crisis in Caracas. Its military installations had been destroyed, and its military capacity had been diminished. The country suffered an attack. However, the government also understood that the US offensive had been targeted. No attacks had been carried out against civilian infrastructure. The airstrikes had not taken place in the cities. Civilians had not been attacked either. What happened was a selective military punishment for the attack on the USS Gravely. The communication was explicit. The United States had the capacity to deploy military power that Venezuela could not withstand. An attack in the future would have more serious effects. After several hours of deliberations, the Venezuelan government issued a statement expressing its deep concern over the US aggression. although it avoided any further escalation. This was a tacit acceptance of the US reprisal in the Caribbean. The USS Gravel, for its part, had been taken to the US naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to repair the damage it had sustained. The ship had sustained considerable damage, although it was possible to repair it. The propulsion systems were partially repaired, allowing the Gravely to navigate under its own power, albeit at lower speeds. The leaks in the hull were sealed. The damaged electronic systems were replaced. It was thought that the full repairs would take about 4 months. The submarine Bolivar, for its part, had fled Venezuelan waters after the attack. He was sailing toward Puerto Cabello in the depths of the Caribbean under the cover of night. Captain Mendez understood that the attack he had carried out had had unforeseen effects. What had been expected to be a regional defense action had turned into an open conflict with the world's most powerful superpower. The Venezuelan Navy had been degraded and the military infrastructure destroyed. There was a political and diplomatic cost that would have to be paid. However, the message that was meant to be conveyed, that Venezuela was willing to protect its territorial waters from US interference, had already been sent. The question that remained was whether that cost had been worth it. As the days passed, diplomatic negotiations began. Diplomatic communications began to be established between Washington and Caracas. The conditions for de-escalation were debated. It was determined that Venezuela would establish an air exclusion zone over its territorial waters, where cooperation with Venezuelan authorities would be necessary. It was agreed that the United States would reduce the number of times its military appeared in the waters near Venezuela. A bilateral security dialogue was established to prevent future incidents. However, the scars would persist, even though the crisis had passed. The Caribbean had undergone a change. The power dynamics in the region had undergone changes. Venezuela had revealed a capacity for resistance that had not been previously known. The United States had shown a willingness to use military force to protect its interests. Although peace had been achieved, albeit fragile, the regional balance of power had shifted.